There was a kingdom in West Africa where daughters were taken from their families at dawn. They were led through palace gates that closed behind them like iron jaws, and they were told a truth that would define the rest of their lives. You will never see your mother again unless you kill. Not once, not in battle, but again, and again, and again, until your hands are so stained with blood that you can no longer remember what it felt like to be a girl. This is the story of the Mino, the warrior women of Dahomey, the ones history tried to forget. In the early 18th century, along the humid coastline of what is now the Republic of Benin, there existed a kingdom that operated under a different moral code than almost any other nation on earth. It was called Dahomey, a name that still carries weight among historians who study the darker corners of human civilization. Dahomey was not a large empire. It did not stretch across continents. It did not build monuments that rivaled the pyramids or temples that still stand today. But it did something far more unsettling. It created a military force composed entirely of women, and it gave them a single, unyielding mandate: kill or never come home. The climate there is oppressive. The air is thick with moisture, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavy. The forests are dense. The roads, in those days, were little more than mud paths carved through vegetation that seemed determined to reclaim every inch of human progress. It was a landscape that swallowed secrets, and Dahomey had many. By the time European traders began documenting their encounters with this kingdom in the late 1600s, Dahomey had already established itself as a military power. It was aggressive, expansionist. It thrived on warfare, and at the heart of its army was a regiment that bewildered and terrified everyone who encountered it. Women, hundreds of them, armed with muskets, blades, and a level of discipline that made hardened soldiers uneasy. They were called the Mino, though Europeans would later call them the Dahomey Amazons, a name that romanticized what was, in truth, something far more brutal. These women were not volunteers. They were not rebels. They were not freedom fighters. They were instruments of the state, selected, taken, transformed, and forbidden to return to the lives they once knew unless they proved themselves worthy through violence. It began with selection. In the villages and towns under Dahomey's control, girls were chosen. Sometimes they were daughters of criminals. Sometimes they were women accused of disobedience or infertility. Sometimes they were simply young and strong. The criteria varied, but the outcome was always the same. Once selected, they were brought to the royal palace in Dahomey, the capital, a sprawling compound of courtyards, walls, and secrets. The palace was a world unto itself, and once you entered, leaving was not a matter of choice. The girls who arrived were stripped of their former identities. Their names, in many cases, were taken. Their clothes were replaced with uniforms. Their hair was cut or shaved. They were no longer daughters, no longer sisters. They were recruits. And the training that awaited them was designed not just to build soldiers, but to break and remake human beings. Imagine being 13 years old. Imagine being torn from your mother's arms at sunrise. Imagine walking through gates that close behind you with a sound like a death knell. Imagine being told that you will not see your family again unless you kill. Not in self-defense, not in a single act of war, but repeatedly, methodically, until your body and mind have been reshaped into something unrecognizable. The training grounds were brutal. The women were subjected to physical conditioning that would break most soldiers. They ran for hours under the equatorial sun. They crawled through thorn bushes until their skin was shredded. They climbed walls with their bare hands. They were beaten if they showed weakness. They were starved if they hesitated. They were taught to endure pain without crying out, to fight without mercy, to kill without hesitation. But the physical training was only the beginning. The psychological conditioning was far more insidious. The Mino were taught that their only family was the regiment. Their only father was the king. Their only purpose was war. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to bear children, forbidden to form attachments outside the army. They were told, repeatedly, that they were no longer women. They were warriors, and warriors did not weep. Warriors did not falter. Warriors did not return home until they had proven themselves in blood. There was a ceremony. Every recruit went through it. It was conducted in the palace courtyard, under the eyes of the king and his generals. The girls, now dressed in their uniforms, were made to kneel. Before them a fire burned, and in that fire a blade was heated until it glowed. One by one they were called forward. One by one they were branded. The mark was placed on their shoulder or their chest, a symbol of ownership, a symbol of transformation. They were no longer citizens, they were property of the crown. And they swore an oath. The words varied, but the meaning was always the same. I will kill for the king. I will die for the king. I will never return home until I have taken a life. Some of the girls wept during the ceremony. Some stood stone-faced. Some tried to run. Those who ran were caught, and they were made examples of, in front of the others, so that everyone understood. There was no escape. There was no mercy. There was only the oath, and the blade, and the blood that would follow. The branding was not just physical. It was psychological. It marked a point of no return, a moment when the girl you had been died, and the weapon you would become was born. And for many of these women, that moment haunted them for the rest of their lives. To understand why Dahomey created the Mino, you have to understand the kingdom itself. Dahomey was a militaristic society. War was not just a means to an end, it was the end. The economy was built on warfare. The slave trade fueled the kingdom's wealth. Dahomey raided neighboring villages and kingdoms, capturing men, women, and children, and selling them to European traders on the coast. The kingdom's power grew with every raid, and with every raid, the need for soldiers increased. But Dahomey faced a problem. It was a small kingdom. Its population was limited, and its wars were constant. The king needed more soldiers. But where do you find them when your male population is already stretched thin? The answer in Dahomey was simple. You conscript women. This was not unprecedented. There are scattered records of female warriors throughout history, but Dahomey took it further than almost any other society. The Mino were not a symbolic force. They were not a novelty. They were a core component of the army. At their peak, they numbered between 4,000 and 6,000. They made up nearly a third of Dahomey's military, and they were, by many accounts, more disciplined and more feared than their male counterparts. The culture of Dahomey celebrated violence. Public executions were common. Ritual sacrifice was practiced. The annual customs, as they were called, were ceremonies in which prisoners of war were beheaded, disemboweled, or thrown from platforms to their deaths. The Mino participated in these rituals. They were not just witnesses, they were executioners, and they were expected to perform their duties without emotion, without hesitation, without humanity. The training of the Mino included a final, horrifying test. Once the women had completed their physical and psychological conditioning, they were brought to a compound within the palace. There, prisoners were kept. Men and women captured in raids. Some were slaves, some were criminals, some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the recruits were told, kill them. Not in battle, not in the heat of combat, but in cold blood, face to face, with a blade or a club. The recruit was handed the weapon, the prisoner was bound, and the order was given, kill. Some recruits hesitated, some wept, some refused. Those who refused were punished, severely. In some cases, they were executed alongside the prisoners. In other cases, they were tortured until they broke, until they complied, until they became what the kingdom demanded they become. Those who passed the test were celebrated. They were given new names. They were welcomed into the ranks of the Mino. They were told they had proven themselves, that they were no longer girls, that they were warriors. But the cost of that transformation was immeasurable, because once you have killed in cold blood, once you have looked into the eyes of another human being and ended their life for no reason other than obedience, something inside you changes, something breaks, or something hardens, and you are never the same. The women who became Mino carried that act with them for the rest of their lives. Some became desensitized, some became ruthless, some became legends, and some, in the quiet moments when they were alone, broke down and wept for the girl they used to be. The Mino lived in the palace. They had their own quarters, separate from the male soldiers. The conditions were Spartan. They slept on mats. They ate simple meals. They were not allowed luxuries. They were not allowed privacy. Their lives were communal, collective. They trained together, ate together, fought together, and in many cases, died together. But despite the harshness, there was a bond among the Mino, a sisterhood born of shared suffering. They understood each other in ways no one else could. They had all been through the same crucible. They had all killed to earn their place. They had all been told they would never go home. And so, in a strange and tragic way, they became each other's home. They were divided into units. Some were armed with muskets, some carried blades, some wielded clubs. Each unit had a specialty, and each unit trained relentlessly. They drilled every day. They practiced formations. They rehearsed attacks. They simulated battles, and they were inspected constantly. Any sign of weakness was punished. Any hesitation was corrected. The Mino were expected to be perfect, and perfection was enforced through fear. But they were also honored. In Dahomey, the Mino held a unique status. They were feared, respected. They had access to the king. They were allowed to speak in councils where other women were silent. They were given privileges that ordinary citizens could never dream of. But those privileges came with a price, and that price was paid in blood. The Mino went to war, often. Dahomey's economy depended on raids. Villages were attacked, towns were burned, people were captured and sold. And the Mino were always at the front. They moved through the forests like ghosts, silent, disciplined, deadly. They attacked at dawn, before the sun rose, before the villagers woke. They surrounded homes, set fires, shot anyone who resisted, and took everyone else captive. The raids were brutal. There was no mercy. Children were torn from their parents. Women were bound and marched away. Men were killed if they fought back. The Mino did not hesitate. They had been trained not to. They had been conditioned to see the enemy not as human beings, but as obstacles, as targets, as bodies to be claimed in the name of the king. European traders who witnessed the Mino in action were horrified. They wrote accounts describing the women as savages, as unnatural, as monstrous. But those accounts were written by men who participated in the slave trade. Men who bought the captives the Mino brought back. Men who profited from the same violence they condemned. And so their horror rings hollow. Because they were complicit. They were part of the system. They were the market that made the raids necessary. The Mino, for their part, did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as soldiers. They were doing what soldiers do. They were following orders. They were serving their king. They were earning their place. And they were, in their own minds, fulfilling the oath they had sworn. The oath that said they could not go home until they had killed. But some of them wanted to go home. Some of them remembered their mothers. Some of them remembered their villages. Some of them lay awake at night and wondered what their lives would have been if they had never been chosen, if they had never been taken, if they had never been forced to kill. There are accounts, scattered and fragmentary, of Mino who tried to leave, who deserted, who ran. Most were caught, and most were executed, publicly, as a warning. But a few succeeded. A few vanished into the forests. A few found their way back to their villages, and a few were welcomed home. But many were not. Because the women who returned were not the girls who had left. They had blood on their hands. They had scars on their bodies. They had darkness in their eyes. And their families did not know what to do with them. Some villages refused to take them back. Some families disowned them. Some communities saw them as cursed, as tainted, as dangerous. And so, even when they managed to escape, even when they made it home, they found that home was no longer home. It was a place they no longer belonged, a place that no longer wanted them. And so, many of them returned to the barracks, not because they were forced to, but because they had nowhere else to go, because the only people who understood them were the other Mino. The only place they belonged was the regiment, and the only life they knew was the life of war. Dahomey's power did not last forever. By the mid-19th century, the kingdom was in decline. The slave trade, which had fueled its economy, was being outlawed by European powers. The British Navy patrolled the coast, intercepting slave ships. The market dried up, and Dahomey's wealth began to crumble. The kingdom tried to adapt. It shifted its economy toward palm oil and other exports. But the transition was difficult, and the military, including the Mino, became increasingly expensive to maintain. The raids continued, but they brought in less profit, and the cost in lives, both Dahomeyan and enemy, was rising. In 1890, France decided to colonize the region. French forces, armed with modern weapons and artillery, invaded Dahomey. The kingdom resisted. The Mino fought. They charged French positions with their muskets and blades. They fought with the same discipline and ferocity they had always shown. But they were outmatched. The French had repeating rifles. They had cannons. They had overwhelming firepower. The Mino were slaughtered. Hundreds of them died in battle. They charged into gunfire. They refused to retreat. They fought until they were cut down. Some accounts describe French soldiers being unnerved by the sight of women running at them with blades, screaming war cries, refusing to stop even as bullets tore through them. It was a massacre. And it was the end. By 1894, Dahomey had been fully colonized. The kingdom was dismantled, the king was exiled, and the Mino were disbanded. Some were captured, some were killed, some simply vanished. The French authorities tried to integrate the surviving Mino into civilian life, but it didn't work. These were women who had been soldiers for decades, who had known nothing but war, who had been told they were warriors, not women, and now they were expected to become farmers, wives, mothers. It was impossible. There are photographs of the Mino. Taken in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they show old women, gray-haired, scarred. Some are missing fingers, some have clouded eyes. They sit in chairs or stand stiffly, staring at the camera with expressions that are hard to read. Some look defiant, some look tired, some look broken. French ethnographers interviewed a few of them, asked them about their lives, about the wars, about the training. Most refused to speak. A few gave brief, clipped answers. One woman, when asked if she regretted her time as a Mino, said simply, "I did what I was told. I survived. That is enough." Another woman, when asked if she had ever wanted to leave, stared at the interviewer for a long moment and then said, "Where would I have gone?" The interviews are haunting, because they reveal women who were trapped, not just by the kingdom, not just by the king, but by the identities that had been forced upon them. They had been told they were warriors. They had been told they were not women. They had been told they could not go home until they killed. And even after the kingdom fell, even after they were free, they carried those messages with them. They had internalized the cage. Some of the survivors lived into the 1940s. The last known Mino died in the 1970s. Her name was Naui. She was over 100 years old. She had been recruited as a teenager. She had fought in the wars against the French. She had survived the fall of the kingdom, and she had lived through colonization, independence, and the birth of modern Benin. When she died, she was the last living link to a world that no longer existed. A world of warrior women. A world of blood oaths. A world where girls were told they could not come home until they had killed. Today, the Mino are remembered in different ways. In Benin, they are celebrated as symbols of national strength. There are statues of them, museums dedicated to them. They are taught in schools as examples of courage and resilience. The narrative has been sanitized. The brutality has been softened. They are portrayed as heroes, as defenders of the kingdom, as warriors who fought against colonization. And there is truth in that. The Mino did fight, they did resist, they did show extraordinary courage. But the full story is darker, because they were not just warriors, they were also victims. They were girls who were taken from their families. They were women who were forced to kill to earn the right to exist. They were human beings who were turned into weapons. And their legacy is not just one of strength, it is also one of trauma, of loss, of lives stolen and identities erased. In the West, the Mino are often romanticized. They are called the Dahomey Amazons. They are compared to mythical warriors. They are held up as examples of female empowerment. And there is something deeply uncomfortable about that, because empowerment implies choice, and the Mino had no choice. They were conscripted, they were conditioned, they were coerced. To celebrate them without acknowledging that is to miss the point entirely. The truth is more complicated. The Mino were extraordinary. They were disciplined, skilled, and formidable. But they were also products of a brutal system. They were instruments of a kingdom that profited from slavery and violence, and they were, in many ways, as much prisoners as the people they captured. There is a question that haunts this story. What does it do to a person to be told they cannot go home until they have killed? What does it do to a 13-year-old girl to be branded and forced to swear an oath of blood? What does it do to a human being to kill, not in self-defense, but in cold blood, as a test of loyalty? The answer is that it breaks something, or it hardens something, or it reshapes something, and the person who emerges is not the same person who went in. The Mino were shaped by violence, they were molded by it, and they carried it with them for the rest of their lives. There is a tendency in our modern age to look at history through a lens of moral clarity, to divide people into heroes and villains, to celebrate the brave and condemn the wicked. But history is rarely that simple. The Mino were not heroes. They were not villains. They were human beings trapped in a system that used them and discarded them. They were soldiers who fought because they had no other option. They were women who killed because they had been told they had to. And that is the tragedy. Not that they fought, not that they killed, but that they were never given a choice, that their lives were stolen from them, that they were told they could not go home, that home was turned into something they had to earn, something they had to pay for, something that, for many of them, no longer existed by the time they were allowed to return. The kingdom of Dahomey is gone. The palace still stands, in part, as a museum. Tourists visit, they take pictures, they listen to guides describe the history, the annual customs, the raids, the Mino. The story is told with a certain distance, as if it happened in another world, as if it has nothing to do with us. But it does. Because the forces that created the Mino, the systems that shaped them, the violence that defined them, those forces still exist. They exist in different forms, in different places, but they exist. We still live in a world where children are conscripted into armies, where girls are stolen and turned into soldiers, where violence is used to break and remake human beings, where people are told they cannot go home until they have proven themselves through bloodshed. The Mino are a reminder, not just of what happened, but of what can happen, of what humans are capable of doing to each other, of how easily we can turn people into weapons, of how quickly we can strip away identity and replace it with obedience. And they are also a reminder of resilience, because despite everything that was done to them, some of the Mino survived. They lived. They endured. They carried their scars and their memories and their trauma, and they kept going. That is not heroism. That is survival. And survival, in the face of such overwhelming brutality, is its own kind of defiance. There was a kingdom in West Africa where daughters were taken from their families at dawn. They were led through palace gates that closed behind them like iron jaws, and they were told a truth that would define the rest of their lives. You will never see your mother again, unless you kill.
Some of them did kill, and some of them went home. But home was not what they remembered. It was not what they had hoped for. It was not a place of comfort or safety or love. It was a place that no longer recognized them, a place that saw them as strangers, as soldiers, as ghosts. And so many of them stayed in the barracks. They stayed with the only people who understood them. They stayed in the only place they belonged, and they lived out their days as warriors, not because they wanted to, but because they had been told so many years ago that they could not go home until they had killed. And even after they had killed, even after they had earned the right to return, they found that there was no home left to return to. That is the story of the Mino, the women who were forbidden to return home until they killed, the women who became weapons, the women who were celebrated and feared and forgotten, the women who carried the weight of a kingdom on their shoulders, and the women who, in the end, had nowhere to go but forward. Their story is not a comfortable one. It is not a simple one. It is not a story with heroes and villains and clear moral lessons. It is a story about power, about violence, about the ways we use people and discard them, about the cost of war, about the price of survival. And it is a story that deserves to be remembered, not because it is inspiring, not because it is empowering, but because it is true, and because the women who lived it, who suffered through it, who died because of it, deserve to be more than footnotes. They deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. Not as heroes, not as villains, but as human beings who were taken, who were broken, who were remade, and who, despite everything, survived. That is their legacy, and it is one we should never forget.